Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
3 days before Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, Frank Knox, Secretary of the U.S. Navy, said that the U.S. Navy was not going to be caught napping. In 1988, Paul Krugman, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, said that by 2005 it will become clear that the internet's economic impact will be no greater than the fax machines. In February 2020, Anthony Fauci, director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, said that the flu was a bigger risk to Americans than COVID.
So right now, don't worry about it. Be more concerned about influenza.
In May 2021, Janet Yellen, the Secretary of U.S. Treasury, told Congress that the pickup in inflation will be temporary. One of the most difficult things to do is to make good predictions. Evidently, even smart and very well-informed people can get them spectacularly wrong sometimes. But which important predictions have survived the test of time? How can you tell the good ones from the bad ones? Hi, I'm David Wu, a former Wall Street global macro strategist with a 20-year track record of making actionable predictions about big global macro events. Welcome to the Money Game, where I take on groupthink, propaganda, and conspiracy theories in my critical analysis of markets, economics, and politics. In today's video, I will discuss two important predictions that have now, in 2022, turned out to be correct. The first is the prediction made back in 2014 by John Mearsheimer, a historian at the University of Chicago, that U.S. policy of eastward expansion of NATO will increase the likelihood of war with Russia. The second is a prediction by Graham Allison, a political scientist at Harvard University, made in 2015, that war between the United States and China was more likely than not, as the perception grows that China will soon challenge the U.S. global hegemony. Mearsheimer's prediction has been vindicated by the Russia-Ukraine war. And while the U.S. and China may not be officially at war, they're now at each other's throat in almost every other way. Indeed, as I've said in my previous videos, the importance of the Russia-Ukraine war lies in the fact that it is precisely a proxy war between the United States and China. Allison's prediction that a war between the U.S. and China is unavoidable is based on what appears to be a historical pattern. In 12 of 16 cases that he identified, in which a rising power has confronted the dominant power, the result has been war. Allison calls this catalyst for war the Thucydides Trap, in reference to a quote from the Greek historian in his seminal work, The Peloponnesian War, in which Thucydides wrote, "The rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta made war inevitable." Now let's look at some of Allison's case studies. By the end of the 19th century, the British Empire was the largest empire the world has ever known, comprising nearly 1/4 of the world's land surface and more than 1/4 of its total population. London was the center of global trade and global finance. Germany was a rising power in Europe. Between 1860 and 1913, Germany's share of global manufacturing increased from 5% to 15%, surpassing Britain, whose shares sank from 20% to 14%. Prior to unification in 1870, Germany had produced only half the steel Britain did. By 1914, it produced twice as much as Britain. In the 1890s, Germany began to build a navy to rival British naval power. Germany's naval buildup frightened British leaders and sparked an intense arms race. As Allison pointed out, the problem for Britain with Germany's rise was not hostility, but rather capability. Britain was wary that as Germany's economy surpassed Britain's, Germany would be able to build the strongest army and navy in Europe. As Henry Kissinger wrote, once Germany achieved naval supremacy, this in itself, regardless of German intentions, would be an objective threat to Britain and incompatible with the existence of the British Empire. Let's look at another one of Allison's case studies. By the 1930s, the United States had overtaken Britain as the most powerful country in the world. In the Pacific, the Americans had grabbed the Philippines in the Spanish-American War of 1898 and colonized it following the Philippine-American War of 1899 to 1902. Meanwhile, Japan was the rising power in Asia. The island nation, with little natural resources of its own, seized Manchuria in 1931, rich in iron and coal, to feed its industrial growth. This led to Japanese invasion of China in 1937. The U.S. attitude towards Japan's expansion was initially one of reluctant acceptance. However, the adoption in 1938 by Japan of the New Order in East Asia to create an Asian Union comprising of China, Japan, and Manchuria through economic and political integration was seen by Washington as a direct challenge to the U.S. open door policy that grant equal privileges to all countries trading with China. This led the Americans to impose severe economic sanctions against Japan in order to restrict its ability to import critical materials. Roosevelt's decision to impose an oil embargo on Japan in August 1941 was the final straw. As Graham Allison points out, in desperation, Japanese leaders facing the grim prospect of Japan being denied of its energy lifeline approved a plan to deliver a preemptive knockout blow against the United States fleet at Pearl Harbor, clearing the way to seize resource-rich territory in Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies. In conclusion, both case studies show that the challenge of the dominant power by the rising power led to war, initiated either by the dominant power to keep the challenger's capability in check, or by the rising power in reaction to strangling economic sanctions that were inflicted by the dominant power. Similar to Britain in the late 19th century and the US in the 1930s, Washington has been increasingly alarmed by China's growing capability over the past few years. Economically, China has been the world's largest exporter since 2009 and is set to overtake the US in terms of the size of its GDP by 2030. While the US still spends twice as much as China on defense, China has achieved superiority in some areas such as hypersonic missiles and shipbuilding. And while Beijing maintains that it is not pursuing global hegemony, the US policies of the past few years, especially the tightening of restrictions of sales of American technology to China, suggest Washington is not taking any risks. The crippling economic sanctions that Washington has unleashed on Russia may be at least in part designed to seriously weaken China's single most important ally. The fact that China has stood steadfast behind Russia in its war with Ukraine shows Beijing understands that if US succeeds in bringing down Putin with his economic war, China could very well be next. The US, China, and Russia have enough nuclear bombs between them to destroy the planet 10 times over or more. The received wisdom is that this fact alone will prevent war, as there could be no winner. However, the total war Washington has unleashed on Russia in 2022 is raising serious questions about this received wisdom. Einstein famously predicted, "I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones." Last week, I launched a Cold War II survey in partnership with ReWe, a Canadian data firm and a leader in online survey technologies. We conduct high-frequency surveys of citizens in the US, China, and Russia to find out what they think about the evolving conflict between the two adversarial blocs. Given the disinformation war that's being fought by all sides, it has become much more difficult to monitor reality. This survey is designed to measure public perceptions of the changing global realignment. The survey has two purposes. One, it should help us better anticipate the direction of the conflict. In other words, making better predictions. Two, by publicizing our findings, we wish to help clear any misunderstanding between the two sides that inadvertently would push them into war. So what is the survey revealing to us right now? One, 25% of the Russian public views the US as an enemy, while 22% of Americans view Russia as an enemy. Two, 16% of Chinese view the US as an enemy versus 15% of Americans who view China as an enemy. What this tells me is that despite the warmongering by politicians, average Americans and average Chinese do not support going to war with each other, at least not yet. That's good news. Three, 37% of Russians see China as an ally, but interestingly, only 24% of Chinese view Russia as an ally. This suggests to me that US sanctions against Russia have pushed Russia closer to China. If you're an American or a European, this is bad news, as China and Russia working together will make them far more formidable adversaries to the West. 4, 70% of Chinese and 80% of Russians believe their side have the upper hand in the conflict. 73% of Americans think that the US and its allies have the upper hand. 5, only 31% of Americans and 33% of Chinese think that they should support their country even if it's in the wrong. However, 42% of Russians think this way. The fact that such high number of Russians think that their side have the upper hand and that they owe their absolute loyalty to their country can only mean one thing. The Putin regime is less vulnerable to America's economic war than the Biden administration may be banking on. 36% of Chinese, 37% of Russians, and 37% of Americans think that what is most at stake in the global power struggle is the prospect for economic power for their country. All three think that this is more important than prestige, cultural identity, or even their political system. This is, of course, crazy, as one of the most powerful insights to come out of economic research of the last 250 years is that economic prosperity is not a zero-sum game. To the contrary, war, arms race, sanctions will make everybody poor. The Russia-Ukraine war is a dress rehearsal for the new Cold War between the United States and China. For both Washington and Beijing, much is riding on the outcome of this war. As I've said in a previous video, Russia is doing better than the Ukrainian and Western propaganda would suggest. My other survey with ReWe, the Military Conflict Risk Survey, that measures public perception of whether military conflict is escalating or de-escalating, is reinforcing my view that the Russian campaign in Ukraine is doing much better than is generally assumed in the West. Our survey has seen a massive increase in the number of Ukrainians and Russian respondents over the past 10 days, saying that they expect military conflict to intensify. Both series are now at the highest level since the start of the invasion. It tells me that our respondents think that we are entering into a decisive phase of the war that will determine its outcome. Even more interesting is the fact that until 3 weeks ago, the number of Ukrainian respondents saying that military conflict was intensifying had been going down, which I interpret as saying that Ukrainian citizens were buying the propaganda of their own government at the time that they were beating the Russians on the battlefield. The fact that all of a sudden this trend is reversing is consistent with my hypothesis that the Ukrainian public, closer to the action, is waking up to the grim reality. This is also consistent with the fact that just 2 weeks after the US had sent $800 million worth of arms to Ukraine, Biden announced last week that he was sending another $800 million worth of weapons to Kiev. These survey data gave me more confidence that my prediction that over the next 2-3 weeks, momentum is with the Russian side. In my view, the biggest question and risk to the world economy, and to the world financial market right now is this: can Biden afford to let Putin win this war? And how far Biden is prepared to go to stop Russia from victory? Frankly, this question scares me and keeps me up at night. I suspect Graham Allison and John Mersheimer may be feeling the same way. I try to put myself in the shoes of Joe Biden. What would I do given my approval rating is the second lowest since the 1950s? My son is being investigated by the FBI for money laundering, tax fraud, and foreign lobbying. And my party is facing a major defeat in 6 months. The easiest thing seems to be just continuing on the course that I've embarked on. This is not a prediction, but a gut feeling. So please don't hold me to it, but you get the point. If you got something out of this program, I would appreciate if you hit like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you want to watch the second part of this video, in which I discuss my investment strategy, in particular how to use stocks, bonds, and currencies to express this macro theme and others, please come visit us at davidwuunbound.com. Thank you for listening.